Right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jonathan Eyal from the Royal United Services Institute in London, and welcome to this session that tries to ask really how much the European security arrangements have changed as a result of the war in Ukraine. Now, we deliberately chose a cliche, and it's a rather overworked cliches with hints to the Titanic, largely in order to ask that question. Everyone, every European leader, every transatlantic leader talks about how the world has changed, what an epoch-changing event the war in Ukraine is. But we will try to unpack in the next 40 minutes or so how much has been done and how much more needs to be done in security terms. Now, I'm joined by Sir David Lidington, who was Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, one of the longest-serving Europe ministers, and is now chair of my institute in London. Oana Lungescu, known to many of you, who had a very distinguished career in the media, in the BBC, and subsequently was the chief spokesperson for NATO and is now a distinguished fellow at my institute, and Edward Arnold, who works on European defense at the institute, and unlike many other armchair strategists, has actually had active military experience as well as academic approach to the subject. We hope to be able to, in the time left to us, perhaps even include one or two questions, which I can repeat if there isn't a sound system available. It would be nice to engage with some of you directly in the debate. So David, over to you.
Jonathan, thank you very much indeed. So I'm going to try and be brief and look at this in terms of the broad overall picture and give you in particular a UK perspective. Starting point, I think that whether you talk to the ruling Conservative Party or the opposition Labour Party in London, both are clear that Putin's aggression in Ukraine adds up to an existential challenge to all our assumptions about the security and defence of the European democracies. If Putin were to secure a victory in Ukraine, we should not kid ourselves. This would mean not only that Moldova and Georgia would be at risk, but that active Russian efforts to destabilize emerging and very young democracies in the Western Balkans would accelerate, and that Moscow's attempts to subvert the longer established democracies amongst EU member states, particularly, but not just in Central Europe, would continue apace. And there may or may not be a change of government at the British general election this year, but I have sat with the Labour Party's top defence team, who have been absolutely clear that if there's a change of government in the UK, there will not be a change of British policy towards Ukraine. This is something where there is very, very firm cross-party support. Now, the challenge is made more acute because this Russian aggression is happening at the same time as the United States is moving towards an attitude that combines American nationalism, putting American interests avowedly first, with an increasing focus on the Indo-Pacific when it comes to looking at the world beyond America's shores. What is perceived in Washington as the global contest between the US and China is occupying the thoughts of Democrats and Republicans alike. And while I certainly am with those who think that the election of Mr. Trump, if that happens, we don't know, it may pose a real additional challenge to the model of transatlantic security that we've held to for 70 years, and the deadlock in Congress over Ukraine at the moment suggests those fears are real. But we shouldn't kid ourselves. If it's a Democrat administration or a Democrat Congress, that overall shift in US strategy is going to continue because that's what American voters are wanting from their elected representatives. So what does Europe do in those circumstances? Well, it seems to me that there are a number of things we have to do. We first of all have to try and keep America engaged, and that means, yes, getting others, everybody in NATO, spending at least the 2% minimum commitment that we've all committed ourselves to do. Secondly, I think it does mean that those European countries that can do so should be giving some support to the US in its areas of chief concern in the Indo-Pacific through things like AUKUS. And also it means European countries taking on more of a political leadership role when it comes perhaps to crises in Africa and other things that the US may not be interested in. Western Balkans is another key area for European security concerns, which I think the US is less bothered with now than it would have been in President Clinton's day. But there are other things we have to do as well. We have to not just spend more, but we need to look at how Europe might get greater capability to act, if necessary, without US involvement. And that means a number of big challenges cannot be avoided. One is, what is the institutional structure, and what in particular does that mean for the UK-EU relationship? Now, I'd certainly argue that NATO is the key collective security and defence organisation for Europe, tried and tested. That should be where any European pillar is anchored, but one accepts that the European Union has taken on in this crisis a greater role in security and defence policy than it has in the past, and we need to work out how that operates. If the Labour Party wins the British election, then they've said publicly they will make a big offer of defence and security cooperation with the EU. How does that then translate into a more effective European pillar within the transatlantic alliance? Secondly, what do we need to do about sharing capabilities? We can't have every country doing everything. Might the British-French treaties of Saint-Malo and Lancaster House provide a model of how you can have force configuration and shared capabilities which are able to act in an emergency with the plans of command and control, the deployment of forces all worked out in the planning stage? Third, what do we do about defence industries? Because there's a clash here. On the one hand, Thierry Breton would say this is part of the EU single market, but on the other hand, there's an Article 4 treaty carve-out for national security, and you talk to governments in the Baltics, in Northern Europe, they're very suspicious about becoming totally dependent on French military suppliers and, frankly, mistrustful of Germany because of Germany's reluctance to allow the export of defence material that has German components to Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and, of course, in the news, to Ukraine. So how does that work out? What's the future for, in a NATO context, for US defence industries, for UK defence industries, in the relationship with the EU's developing a thought on this? And then finally, unavoidably, we have to do some serious thinking about nuclear. If the worst happens, if the US nuclear guarantee that we've all taken for granted since the late 1940s and the creation of NATO were not to prove to be so reliable in the future, can Europe put in place its own nuclear deterrence theory and capability when we're facing aggression from a nuclear-armed power in Russia? What does that mean for a UK deterrent that is at NATO's disposal but under national control, a French deterrent that is not in the same way under NATO, at NATO's disposal? Would Germany want to be actively involved? Does Poland have ideas of its own? Who would have the authority to use and take decisions on a hypothetical European nuclear deterrent? I don't have an instant answer, but I'd say we cannot, as European democracies, avoid engaging in those arguments and doing so quickly, but we should do so with the confidence that if we look to ourselves, have the political will, we can solve these problems. At the end of the day, the non-US members of NATO have a GDP combined that is about 10 times the size of Russia's GDP. What is holding us back is not a lack of wealth or a lack of ability. It is a lack of political will and the willingness to take those difficult decisions. That's what we need to do, and do so urgently.
Thank you so much. Thank you for reminding us of the enormity of the challenges facing us. So we have all our leaders talking about it all the time, but this is just the beginning of the debate if we are serious about our defense arrangements. Oana, you were 10 years, more than a decade, very close to all these discussions. How is the alliance faring at the moment with this kind of a challenge?
I think I fully agree with Sir David that this is an existential moment, and what we collectively do as NATO, the EU, European allies really matters. And of course, what we don't do also matters. And it can define the course of history for generations to come. The good news, I think, is that neither Europe nor NATO nor the European Union are the Titanic, to answer the provocative question in the title of this panel. But we are on a dangerous journey through uncharted waters, and I think we need to first make sure that Ukraine stays afloat and is headed to victory, that NATO and the European Union are stronger but also faster in their action, and also that we keep both Europe and North America on board. Because I think we could risk a Titanic moment if either Europe or America tried to go it alone. I think in a world where we see autocracies coming much closer together, in particular, we can see that in the support for Russia in its war in Ukraine by China, Iran, North Korea, it would be absolutely tragic if the democracies of Europe and North America don't stick together. In terms of what NATO has done, I would say, the war did not start, the war in Ukraine did not start in 2022. The war in Ukraine started at least in 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea. And from that point of view, if NATO, like I think many across the world were shocked and perhaps even surprised in 2014, they were not surprised in 2022. So what we've seen between 2014 and 2024 is a whole decade of transformation, certainly of the alliance, with, for the first time, combat-ready troops from the Baltic to the Black Sea, with greater readiness, with new defense plans, the most detailed defense plans since the Cold War, with much more defense spending, and hopefully by the Washington summit in July, we'll have at least 2/3 of the 32 allies investing at least 2% of GDP in defense. But also, importantly, there is a 20% metric of investment in modernization and research and development. And there we have 28 out of the 32 allies meeting or going beyond that metric. And that is significant because this is not just about money, it's about capabilities and making those capabilities available to NATO. We've also seen, I would say, absolutely historic enlargements of NATO, where I think the EU has been late, but it's now catching up fast. I think the enlargements to the Western Balkans with Montenegro, with North Macedonia, absolutely historic, and of course the most recent enlargements with Sweden and Finland. Those are geostrategic game changers, and they totally show Putin's failure to achieve his ultimate goal, which is to have less NATO and a weaker NATO. And of course, stronger partnerships around the world, because even though NATO is a regional alliance of Europe and North America, the challenges we face are global. So the fact that there are now stronger partnerships with the Indo-Pacific 4 partners, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, and that they will be invited again to the Washington summit, I think is very significant about how we need to also look beyond the borders of the Euro-Atlantic area and partner with other democracies, other like-minded countries around the world. But where I think we still need to do, actually before I say that, let me just also commend Greece. Greece, of course, has almost always been investing more than 2%, actually over 3%, is also more than meeting the 20% metric in terms of investments in modernization, and we've seen a very rapid modernization, especially in the last few years. Greece, of course, plays a very important role in the Western Balkans, supporting one of the 2 allies that supports air policing in Montenegro, and of course a very important logistics hub, both for the US and for other allies with the port of Alexandropoli, and very importantly, a very strong principled supporter of Ukraine. So I think Greece is doing a lot in this transformed alliance. But where I think we need to do much more is in terms of the defense industrial base, European, but actually transatlantic, because I think it's quite hard to imagine the European production both of armaments and equipment in isolation. It would be, those would be quite strange equipment that we would end up with. We really need to go beyond 2% when it comes to investment in defense. And again, as I said, I think Greece is showing the way, but also using those capabilities to implement the new defense plans. We really need to up our game when it comes to supporting Ukraine. And there, of course, political will, after almost more than 2 years where we've seen unprecedented support for Ukraine, this is actually the testing time. So we cannot afford to fail now. And it's really, I think it's really important to have this debate here, to have President Zelensky earlier on, because in the end, it's also about hearts and minds in each of our countries.
Thank you very much, Oana. Thank you for reminding us. This was one senior European leader only a few years ago dismissed the alliance as brain dead. I think the same senior European leader will not make that statement today. The alliance has transformed itself in many ways, but as Oana reminded us, there's a great deal of work still to be done. Edward, over to you and perhaps capabilities and what has been done on the ground.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. I think, firstly, before I move on to capabilities, I just want to talk a little bit about the threat and contextualize it. NATO is a military organization. The first stage of planning is what the enemy is doing and why. And I think prior to 2022, Europe always arranged its defense and security around internal political drivers rather than external threats. And that is certainly changing. And I absolutely agree with Oana in terms of the transformation which has been going on since 2014, and it is impressive. But I still think Europe has been reactive to Russian aggression and action, where it needs to now change and ultimately be proactive and gain that initiative. And in terms of the threat, last week a senior US official assessed that the Russian military had almost completely reconstituted, and there's a current assessment of around 470,000 troops within the vicinity of Ukraine, which is a lot. I think the quality overall is significantly reduced over the last 2 years, but in terms of the numbers, that is certainly a lot. And the UK Ministry of Defence, on the 2-year mark in February, assessed that up to 350,000 Russian troops had been killed or injured. And the assessment at that time, very difficult in terms of the data, but that 70,000 Russian troops had been killed. Now, Russia obviously had issues with the planning and the execution. It has not performed how we thought Russia would, but the military is still on the offensive despite all of those losses. This year, it's assessed that it's trying to conscript or contract soldiers a further 400,000, with the ambition of their overall forces moving to 1.32 million this year and subsequently to 1.5 next year. So in terms of a threat, to take all of that punishment within Ukraine and still be on the offensive, I think is significant. And I agree with Oana that decisions made now will really sort of dictate history for generations to come. So what's Europe doing about it? We've already mentioned in terms of the spending. Yes, we are spending more. Back in 2014, there were only 3 allies within NATO who met the 2%. That was the UK, the US, Greece. And as Oana says, Greece. And by the end of this year, it's assessed that around 20 of 32 nations will meet that. But it's not about the raw funds. And the disagreements that you see within Europe are usually how to spend it and what to spend it on, and that's where the duplication and the inefficiencies arise. You're never going to get rid of those duplications and inefficiencies, but you try and need to make it as smooth as possible. But also a little bit of a gap on the rhetoric and the reality of it. Oana's already mentioned all of these new plans. And just to highlight one in terms of forces at high readiness, well, the NATO response force, it used to be 400,000. The total in terms of troops at higher readiness is actually 800,000 within 180 days. And that is going to be a considerable challenge for the alliance. I think Sir David covered the US disengagement part potential in terms of Europe very well. But the key risks that I would like to highlight is on what the military terms enablers. So not in terms of raw combat power, but things like logistics, air-to-air refueling, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, a lot of things that fly around in the air tell you where the enemy is. That is particularly where Europe has not invested over the last 30 years, whereas the US has. And whoever wins the presidential election at the end of this year, over the next coming years, it is highly likely that the US will move enablers out of Europe. So the real problem for Europeans now, yes, we're increasing the money, but actually if we then have to spend it on enablers and not raw combat power, the actual, when you're looking at it from a balance of power, Europe's forces will not significantly increase. And then finally, just about the organizational structure with Europe, Sir David and Oana talked a lot about sort of that multilateral level, so NATO and the EU. And when I first started to specialize in European security, my dissertation advisor said, don't do it, it's boring, go do the sexy stuff like the global war on terror, because it was a cyclical argument, NATO or the EU. I think what's happened since 2022 is it's broke that cyclical argument, and there's now far more alignment on where each should try and focus. Yeah. But actually under that, there's a lot of regional cooperation, especially in the north with 2 new members, Finland and Sweden, and that is actually almost driving some areas. And sort of the final point where I think that is far, highlighted most is at the NATO Vilnius summit last year. The discussions around potential membership of Ukraine at NATO, I mean, they were not resolved at that summit. And sort of almost at the 11th hour, you had the G7 bilateral commitments, which has now grown to almost 32 nations, of which 8 have already been signed. And it shows us this bilateral cooperation, the coalitions of the willing that you've always seen in Europe are now far more willing to get involved to solve the challenges that they see and use that flexibility, which sometimes you don't get from NATO and the EU at that higher level. And I'll stop there, Jonathan.
Thank you so much. You've been admirably good and keeping to the timetable. We've got about 22 minutes at our disposal. I'm sure that our sound people will hate me, but if there are questions from the audience, even I can't hear them, I will repeat them. Apparently that is not feasible and cannot be done. Okay, I'm so sorry about that. We will then try apologies, but apparently that is not likely to work. Let me ask Sir David a question first, which is on the subject of what one European official once said: we all know what needs to be done, we just don't know how to get re-elected after doing it. So you had to run a lot of election campaigns, you had to balance political choices. Do you believe that we have the ability among our politicians to move beyond the 2%? It was a heavy lift to get to the 2%. NATO Secretary General said only last week that the 2%, quite rightly, is not a ceiling, it is a floor. It is the absolute minimum that we can do. It's not the maximum that we can do. After all of us spent 3–4% of GDP on defense during the Cold War. So are you hopeful that we can lift up with countries that have heavy debts like France or Italy, or have a constitutional limit on debts like Germany? Can we do it if very often it makes very serious choices?
I think we can, but I don't want to pretend that this will be easy and straightforward, or that it's going to be the same debate in every European country. I think to some extent in the UK it's easier because both the two big dominant political parties at the moment have more or less the same view about defence policy. In countries where someone like Mrs. Le Pen is not exactly fully behind Ukraine, that argument could be more difficult. But I just think it is so important for the security of all our democracies that we win this, that the argument has to be engaged in. And the reasons I think it can be won are these. First of all, is that what the Ukraine war has shown is pictures in people's living rooms every day through television screens and on mobile devices of the impact of bombing, shelling on ordinary families in the heart of Europe. So it is not something that people can just say it's taking place a long, long way away and it's not people like me. This is happening to people like us. And I think that Zelensky's skill as a communicator has been very helpful on this as well. But those images do assist in making the case for extra defence spending. But I think that it's then a matter of saying that all the other things that you as voters want to see happen, a decent future for your children and grandchildren, where they can live in peace and pursue careers and family lives, have decent public services in schools and health provision and pension provision. These are all at risk if Putin is allowed to prevail. And I think that those are arguments that have been won in Europe before. These are not wholly dissimilar from the arguments that were taking place in the UK and in Germany, in particular, but in other European countries as well, over the deployment of US cruise and Pershing missiles back in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And these were very controversial decisions, but those arguments were won by very determined politicians who were prepared to show leadership and make that case. That is what we're going to have to do again. And it's up to people who are elected to make that case to the voters. Not always easy, but the alternative is far, far worse.
Indeed, and one German chancellor who sacrificed his own political career to push for the deployment of the INF missiles at that particular time. Edward, can I turn to you on the subject of capabilities? And one area you didn't mention is the potential return of conscription, the lack of manpower in Europe, the acute shortages in recruitment capabilities of professional troops that many European countries are facing. Now, we had one row about this with the chief of the army in the UK, but we had other discussions in the Scandinavian countries about restoring or expanding conscription to women in Denmark, for instance, recently, and so on. Do you think that this has not only a sort of capability element, but also an instructive element to what Sir David said about preparing societies for a much bigger challenge?
Absolutely, and I think it was just 27th of December was the first sort of public statement in Europe that I was tracking specifically on this. The NATO chair of the military committee sort of early November said it, and then you got a flurry of activity, I think on my tracker at the moment, of around 12 seniors who both said sort of, you know, this idea that we need to be prepared by at least the end of the decade, 2 to 3 years. I mean, the timeline is not fully aligned with allies, but it was there to sort of, you know, almost jolt and say, well, we need to start to have this conversation. And I think it was a very important intervention by all of those who made it, not to say, well, this is, you know, this is the problem and say conscription is the answer, but just to start to have that debate within countries. And, you know, in the UK, it will be a very, very difficult discussion to have because national service ended in the mid-60s, and it's just something that we've not really considered because of the way that the UK military has been structured and as sort of the wars or conflicts that it's had to fight over the last 30 years. It's easier in some countries that have only you know, got away with conscription sort of in the early 2010s, so Sweden, Germany, you know, to sort of turn the tap back on is going to be much easier there. And you also highlighted one issue that every military within NATO and the EU is facing at the moment is recruitment challenges, but also retention challenges. And retention challenges are actually far more acute than recruitment because of that experience that you lose. And for me at the moment, on the European and also the Russian and the Ukrainian side, experience and the quality of forces really does matter. What you've seen really acutely on the Russian side, like I said in my opening statement, the numbers are there, but the quality is not. And there's a lot of training programs to get the quality of Ukrainian recruits up. But for example, on the UK training programs at the moment, you know, it's 5 weeks of training. So, you know, pure raw recruit, 5 weeks, and the training is really only designed so that you survive your first battle and then sort of continue on from there. The average age 54 as well, so very, very challenging. So I think quality really ultimately matters, and that is the challenge for European nations now, and that takes time, so you need to have the conversations now in order to potentially have those forces ready if, you know, that date is, say, 2030.
But are you optimistic about the possibilities of restoring conscription, or do you think that this is a bit of an irrelevant discussion at the moment?
Well, I think conscription is not fully again, I think when you say conscription in the UK, it's very emotive. I don't think it's necessarily about getting people into uniform in, say, combat roles. There's other ways to do it. And what you see with militaries, you know, over the last couple of decades is as they have started to shrink, they also get used for other things. So, for example, helping with COVID, flooding, you know, backfilling border guards in the UK. That actually, when you look at the overall numbers, it's the demands on the military which actually cause that acute crisis. And you know, it's not necessarily about that. It is about national mobilization, so you can get volunteers in other areas, for example, the National Health Service, which would come under strain in the war, to free up those professional soldiers who are in uniform, rifle in hand, to go and do their job.
Oana, I know that NATO officials have never said it, but nevertheless, it's a very fashionable discussion now about how we can Trump-proof the alliance. Supposedly, how we can take certain measures so that the alliance will not be hurt should Mr. Trump become president and should Mr. Trump decide that NATO is not for the United States. I abbreviate it, of course. Do you think that discussion is helpful, and do you think the discussion has any use at the moment? Because we heard Mr. Zelensky being asked that question directly this morning, and quite rightly, he decided to duck it for very obvious reasons. But do you think it's a useful discussion to sort of proof the alliance against Trump, or is it something that we can do without talking?
I think it's a discussion that's out there, but of course, this is not just about the American elections. You look at elections all around the alliance, and there's probably one every day. And there may be leaders that may like NATO more or less, but that's in the end, that's democracy. So I think these are absolutely normal discussions to have in democracies. Thank God we live in democracies, right? But I would say that what's really important is that we continue to invest in what unites us rather than in what divides us as Europe and North America. And there's still talk about the idea of European strategic autonomy, which would mean, autonomous means that you do things on your own, and strategic means that you do the big things on your own. Now, I think what the Ukrainian crisis has shown is that we are much more effective when we stick together. And that's also a message that is, I think, very obvious in the United States, where we see unprecedented levels of support for NATO in all the polling, and that's bipartisan support also in the US Congress. And that's something that Donald Trump knows, and I think that is an important reality. Where I think it's important to look at how we can, if you want, try to further insulate institutions such as NATO, multinational organizations such as NATO, from political changes wherever they may happen, is in investing in those institutions, rather than saying we don't need these institutions, let's invent other formats, or let's stick, let's do Europe alone or America alone. I think that's not a recipe of success for either Europe or America. We need each other in this big, dangerous world where others are sticking together. So, for instance, I wouldn't call it Trump-proofing, but I think there is an understanding that we need to put support for Ukraine on a more sustainable basis, and that's why the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, came up with this idea of what is called a mission for Ukraine, which goes beyond just financing possibly up to $100 billion for Ukraine support, but it's also about training and equipping the Ukrainian armed forces, because I think there is a need to go beyond the sometimes, the multiplicity of initiatives and formats that we have right now in terms of supporting Ukraine, some of which are very, very effective, some which may be somewhat duplicative. So I think this idea of trying to have an overarching framework for support for Ukraine, where the Ukrainians can know in advance what they can rely on, what's in the pipeline, so that they can plan not just their defensive, but their next offensive, I think that has a lot of value. And my hope is that this mission for Ukraine is agreed by the Washington summit. And I think it's important to note that actually SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Cavoli, who is also, of course, a US general, has now been tasked by foreign ministers to plan this mission and to look at the options. So that is actually quite a powerful decision, which does show the political will to move forward together when it comes to Ukraine, regardless of political changes, wherever they may come.
Now, you mentioned in your initial remarks the possibility of engagement with countries outside Europe, democracies in Asia, for instance, which is a key concern for the United States. Would you say that there is a consensus or even the beginning of a consensus about what NATO needs to do or can do on these topics among the 32 member states?
I think it's, you just need to listen to what the leaders of Japan and South Korea and others say, which is that what happens in Europe today may happen in Asia tomorrow. So I think they are very aware of the high stakes in terms of the course of the war in Ukraine, not just for Europeans, but also for countries in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Because of course, should Putin prevail in Ukraine, we would not just deal with an emboldened Putin leading a revisionist Russia. That would also send a signal to all his other friends and allies that you can use force to achieve your political aims, and that you will do that with relative impunity. So I think it's a mutual interest. Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand do want to do more with NATO, but it's not necessarily about, deploying vast NATO fleets to the region. I think the political signaling is important, and doing more in terms of cyber, hybrid, maritime, all these things, countering disinformation, where of course we see Russia and China echoing each other's talking points. I think that sends an important message in itself. And there is unity on that, even though there may be allies that have different viewpoints on whether we open an office in Japan or not.
So David.
I thought it was an important point, because I think that one of the things that's come home to us in recent years, and is becoming more apparent as we read of the developments in new technologies, is how our societies now are more and more dependent upon global shipping lanes, upon global aviation, upon subsea cable networks, upon satellite communications, which are global in their nature, and all of which are potentially at risk to hostile state action. And those are realities that make it increasingly hard to think of Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific as entirely distinct theatres. I mean, there are clearly important challenges that are specific to each, but also it seems to me that reinforces the need for closer collaboration between the democratic countries of the Indo-Pacific region and the democracies of the Euro-Atlantic sphere.
Indeed, and we mustn't forget that one of the biggest suppliers of weapons at the moment in Europe is actually South Korea, and in terms of, for instance, the Polish rearmament.
But also, if you look at the first visit of the Japanese Prime Minister was to Ukraine, just as President Xi was in Moscow at the time. So I think that in itself is very important political signaling that, yes, the stakes are huge, and it's not just for Europe.
I will squeeze one final question to you, Sir David, in what, a minute and a half. When Brexit happened and you were there and you were helping to negotiate a rather, for me, unhappy situation, There were a lot of people saying that the United Kingdom would lose a voice in Europe permanently. It didn't happen on defense in the case of Ukraine. We led in many respects on the discussion of Ukraine. Are you confident that Britain could continue leading the European defense discussion while remaining outside the European Union?
I mean, yes, look, I think, I, like you, Jonathan, hoped for a different result from our referendum in 2016, but the result was what it was. And I think rejoining is just not a live political issue for either Conservative or Labour at the moment, or for that matter for the 27.
No.
And I think that's something, when my children's generation are running the country in another decade might happen. But yes, I think what Ukraine has reminded us of is that there are very much more important arguments at stake than arguing about the rules on the filling of sandwiches going to Northern Ireland. And it's actually forced us to look at the big picture again and forced us to recognise that what we have in common and what is at stake in this current crisis is more important than those detailed regulations that we are arguing about. And I think since the Windsor Framework agreed the rules on trade between Northern Ireland, Great Britain and the EU single market, we're in a much better place now to see a step-by-step rebuilding of the UK outside membership, but the UK-EU relationship, and I think that's what we'll see, whether it's a Labour or a Conservative government after our election later this year.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry that for technical reasons we couldn't engage in a bigger discussion with the audience, but I do agree that we had probably a very good discussion here on stage, and I hope that we have conveyed to you the central message, which is that we are facing a different crisis from the crisis that faced us in the past. We heard from the previous speakers only a moment ago from the ambassador about how epoch-changing this is of the return of war to Europe. It is a different world. We're working at it. There is much more to be done. Thank you from the Royal United Services Institute, and see you soon.